All 16-year-old Zara Brenham wanted was peace. Just 2 quiet weeks with her father. Xavier, away from the chaos of his world-saving job. Away from missed birthdays and whispered apologies. She had waited years for this trip. A promise made and finally kept. No agents. No buzzing phones. No, just 5 more minutes. Just them, father and daughter, under the Bali sun. As they walked through the bustling airport terminal, she stayed close by his side. Her heart light, her hopes high. Xavier was more than a dad. He was the FBI's director of counterterrorism. A man whose presence shifted rooms. Whose phone rang at all hours. Whose life was a battlefield of secrets and strategy. Zara had grown up understanding she was second to the mission. No piano recitals. No school plays. Just, maybe next time, sweetheart. But today was different. He looked tired in a way she hadn't seen before, not just physically, but emotionally worn, as if the years he'd missed were finally catching up to him. Maybe he was realizing she wasn't a little girl anymore. Maybe he knew it was time. So she believed him, just enough. She packed his sunscreen, checked the itinerary twice, reminded herself that this wasn't just a trip, it was a chance to feel seen. As they reached the gate, she moved slower, like savoring a memory before it even happened. Boarding was smooth, familiar, first class, row 3, window seat for her, aisle for him, the quiet ritual. But just as she began to settle into the comfort of this long-awaited moment, his phone buzzed. Langley, a promise cracked. 10 minutes, he said, and just like that, he was gone, again. Zara sat alone, watching the clouds beyond the glass. Hands folded in her lap. Her heart steady but bruised. She had hoped, deeply and quietly, that this time would be different. That this time, she wouldn't have to wait. The cabin was calm, humming with quiet conversations and the soft rustle of blankets being unwrapped. But Zara felt a strange chill despite the warm air. She was alone again, her father's seat beside her empty, a silence she knew too well. And then came the sound, sharp, rhythmic, heels clacking down the aisle like punctuation to an invisible statement. She glanced up, a woman, late 30s, blonde, impeccably dressed, radiated entitlement with every step. Her designer bag swinging dangerously close to other passengers' heads. Her expression tight with annoyance. "Excuse me," she snapped, glaring down at Zara. "You're in my seat." Zara blinked, politely explaining that her boarding pass clearly stated 3A, the window seat, but the woman wasn't interested in facts. She demanded, insisted, questioned, not the seat, but Zara's right to be in it. Her voice sharpened as she muttered under her breath, just loud enough for others to hear, "People like you don't usually fly first class." The words hit harder than a slap, slicing through Zara's practiced poise. She sat still, every breath calculated, every muscle tense, trying not to show the ache building in her chest. She had heard this tone before, at galas, in classrooms, even in silence, the condescending disbelief that she could belong. Bethany Caldwell, the woman now standing with hand on hip and fake smile twisting her lips, raised her voice and called for the flight attendant. As if Zara were a problem to be removed. Passengers shifted in their seats, glancing without helping, their silence heavy with complicity. Zara reached for her phone, typed a message to her father, then paused. She wanted to handle this herself, to stay composed, to hold her ground with dignity. She chose silence, not out of fear, but power. But even so, her heart pounded with a familiar ache, a reminder that no matter how calm you stay, prejudice always finds a way to speak louder. And in that moment, seated by the window in a plane full of strangers, Zara knew she wasn't just defending a seat, she was defending her right to exist in that space. Unchallenged, unapologetic. The cabin door hissed open with a soft metallic breath. Barely noticed at first, just another sound in the background of a tense, uncomfortable silence. But something shifted. A presence entered, subtle yet undeniable, the kind that makes people straighten instinctively without understanding why. Xavier Brenham stepped into the plane with the calm gravity of a man used to command. Dark suit, eyes sharp, every step deliberate. He didn't rush, didn't speak, he didn't have to. His presence carried weight, not the kind born of arrogance, but of authority forged in fire. Passengers who moments ago sat silent in complicity now watched, holding their breath. Zara didn't turn to look, she didn't need to. She felt the air change, felt her spine ease ever so slightly. He was here. Bethany, still standing like a queen of chaos, mistook him for another executive flyer, someone she could shout down. "You need to stay out of this," she barked, her voice laced with outrage. "My husband will hear about this." But when Xavier calmly asked what had happened, the flight attendant, voice steady but respectful, explained it all. Bethany jabbed her finger at Zara again, declaring she didn't belong, still unaware that the man she was now threatening was the very person her husband reported to. And then, with the precision of a surgeon, Xavier reached inside his jacket, revealed his badge, FBI, Counterterrorism Division, and let silence speak. Bethany's face paled, her smirk collapsed. He didn't yell, he didn't need to. He spoke with clarity and restraint, calling out her cruelty, her entitlement, her weaponized privilege. And then, instead of vengeance, he offered justice, a suggestion to reassign Bethany's seat to an elderly woman in need. No drama, no spectacle, just a quiet rebalancing of dignity. As he sat beside his daughter, no words passed between them at first. But Zara exhaled, for the first time in what felt like forever. The weight wasn't hers alone. She hadn't needed rescuing, she had stood tall. But now, with her father beside her, she no longer had to fight that battle in silence. Not anymore. The plane soared through the clouds. But inside row 3A and 3B, there was a stillness, not awkward, but full, like the space after a storm has passed and left behind something clearer. Zara leaned back in her seat, her fingers brushing her father's hand, not out of need, but out of something deeper, trust. For the first time in years, she wasn't carrying the moment alone. She had stood her ground with quiet strength, with dignity. But now, sitting beside him, she allowed herself to exhale, not just because it was over, but because she knew he saw her, truly saw her. Later, in Bali, the days unfolded like soft chapters of a long-forgotten book. She ran barefoot across black sand beaches, laughed as her father struggled with a coconut, and watched him loosen in ways she had never seen before. Not the director, not the protector, just Dad. They shared street food under neon lights, fed monkeys in temple gardens, took wrong turns on rented bikes and didn't rush to correct them. At night, they sat in silence on the deck of their villa, the ocean whispering below, stars scattered above, and something whole settling between them. On the final evening, Zara asked softly, "Do you think she'll change?" Her voice held no bitterness, just curiosity. Xavier let the waves answer first, then replied, "No one changes overnight, but sometimes one crack is enough for the light to get in." She nodded, her face glowing under the moonlight. No longer just a girl trying to be enough, but a young woman who had realized she already was. The trip hadn't erased the past, but it had mended something delicate, something essential, the understanding that justice, when wrapped in love and presence, doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it sits beside you quietly, watches the tide roll in, and stays. The return flight felt different, not because the destination had changed, but because something within Zara had. She no longer needed the window seat, no longer clung to the silence like armor. This time, she let her father take it, and she leaned gently against his shoulder, the gesture small but full of everything they hadn't been able to say before. The sky outside turned from soft blue to gold as the plane lifted. And for the first time in a long while, she felt the weight of the world soften. The trip hadn't been perfect, nothing truly healing ever is, but it had stitched something back together, a trust, a presence, a shared understanding that didn't need constant words. Zara no longer needed to prove she belonged. Not in first class, not in her father's world, not anywhere. She had learned that power wasn't about titles or force, it was about restraint. About knowing you could roar but choosing to stay steady, measured, kind. She had felt that in the moment her father stood beside her. Not as a director, but as a man who had finally chosen to show up in the way that mattered most. And perhaps, just perhaps, that was what real strength looked like, not dominance, but gentleness that refused to be erased. For Bethany Caldwell, the moment might fade into discomfort, into shame, maybe even growth, but for Zara, it had already transformed into clarity. She didn't need to shout to be heard. She didn't need to fight to matter. She simply needed to know she would never have to stand alone again. As the clouds stretched beneath them and the hum of the engines filled the space, she closed her eyes for a moment, not to escape, but to hold on to the peace that now lived quietly within her, a peace earned not through victory, but through being seen, supported, and finally understood. In Bali, time unfolded not in hours or minutes, but in moments, vivid, fleeting, unforgettable. Zara ran barefoot along the black sand, laughter echoing as the waves chased her heels. Xavier, once the man with the stiff suit and endless calls, now fumbled with coconuts under the hot sun, grinning as she filmed him. Unguarded and real, they shared grilled corn from street stalls, wandered temple grounds in quiet awe, fed monkeys who snatched peanuts with tiny, greedy hands, and rode rented bikes down roads that led nowhere but somehow felt exactly right. It wasn't just a vacation, it was a homecoming. Not to a place, but to each other. They sat on the villa's deck at night, ocean breathing below them, stars scattered above like promises. The silence between them was no longer heavy, it was warm, full, understood. On their last evening, Zara asked, not accusingly but with the curiosity of someone braver than before, "Do you think she'll change?" Xavier didn't answer immediately. He let the waves answer first, then replied softly, "No one changes overnight, but sometimes one crack is enough for the light to get in." She didn't need more than that. In his presence, she felt not just protected, but valued, no longer the girl waiting in silence, but someone finally seen. The lesson wasn't in victory or confrontation. It was in restraint, in the quiet strength of holding your ground with grace, and in knowing when to step forward, and when to simply be there. As the waves whispered below and the warm night wrapped around them, Zara leaned back, her heart steady, no longer aching for what was missing. This trip hadn't fixed everything, but it had shifted something deep, something that couldn't be undone. And as they sat side by side, nothing needed to be said, because for the first time in a very long time, both of them understood that love isn't in grand gestures. Sometimes, it's just in showing up and staying. The story didn't end when the plane touched down, it lingered, like a quiet echo in the minds of everyone who witnessed it. For some passengers, it would become a memory shared in hushed tones over coffee, a moment they couldn't quite forget. For others, it might live as a soft shift in the way they saw the world, the way they responded the next time someone was silenced, belittled, or told they didn't belong. Bethany Caldwell, once so certain of her status and entitlement, had been cracked open, not destroyed, but exposed. And maybe, just maybe, that moment of raw shame would be the beginning of something better. The first crack that lets the light in. But for Zara, the change was already complete. She didn't carry bitterness, she carried clarity. She had always been strong, always dignified, always composed beyond her years, but now, she understood that her voice didn't need to be loud to be powerful. She had stood her ground with grace, faced injustice not with fury, but with stillness, and in doing so, taught the entire cabin what true strength looks like. And her father, once a shadow in her life, present only in promise, had stepped fully into the light, not to save her, but to stand beside her. That mattered, that stayed. Their trip didn't heal every scar, didn't erase the missed birthdays or silent dinners, but it rewrote something, the future. When they boarded the flight home, Zara gave him the window seat, leaned against his shoulder, and let herself rest, not because she was tired, but because she could. And as the clouds rose to meet them once more, she didn't feel small, or invisible, or unsure. She felt whole, and in the quiet hum of that return journey, wrapped not in turbulence but in trust, she knew one thing for certain: she would never again question whether she belonged. Not in a seat, not in a space, not in this world. As the return flight drifted above the Pacific and the cabin lights dimmed to a soft glow, Zara sat nestled beside her father, the quiet between them not empty, but full of everything they now understood. Her head rested gently against his shoulder, not out of habit or obligation, but because it felt right, like the final piece falling into place. In the gentle hum of the engines, she reflected not just on what had happened, but on what it had revealed. For years, she had tried to be enough, the perfect student, the polite presence, the quiet achiever, always believing that if she worked hard enough, stayed quiet enough, stayed small enough, the world would finally let her belong. But this trip had shown her something else, that her worth was never tied to her ability to shrink herself to fit. It wasn't in the way she remained calm under fire, or the way she carried herself through hurt with grace. It was in the simple, unwavering truth that she didn't owe the world a performance to justify her place in it. She didn't need to be exceptional to deserve dignity. She didn't need to prove her humanity to earn respect. She was already enough, as she was, where she was, and as her father sat beside her, no longer distracted, no longer distant, but fully present, not just in body, but in heart. She realized something even deeper. His love had always been there, buried beneath duty and silence. But now it had a voice, a shape, a weight she could finally lean on. He hadn't just stood up for her, he had chosen to stay. And that choice, that simple act of presence, was what began to close the gap years of absence had carved. The plane began its slow descent, and for the first time in her life, Zara didn't brace herself for impact. She let the earth rise to meet her, steady and sure. Whatever lay ahead, she knew now, she would walk into it with her head high, her voice clear, and the unshakable truth that she belonged. Bali became more than a destination, it became a quiet transformation. Stitched together not with grand gestures but with the kind of moments that live forever in the spaces between words. Zara ran barefoot along the shoreline, waves chasing her steps, laughter tumbling from her lips like it hadn't in years. She filmed her father as he wrestled with a stubborn coconut. Both of them doubled over in laughter beneath the golden sun. They wandered through temple ruins, fed monkeys with hesitant hands, shared grilled corn from roadside stalls, and took wrong turns that turned into memories. They were no longer strangers bridged by blood but companions rediscovering each other in the warmth of simplicity. In the evenings, they sat side by side on the deck of their villa, the ocean stretching endlessly before them, stars spilling across the sky like scattered intentions. They didn't talk about the plane, or the years lost, or the ache that had once filled the silence between them. They didn't need to. The stillness held it all, the apologies never spoken, the love finally understood. On their last night, as the waves whispered secrets only the moon could hear, Zara asked, not with bitterness but with wondering, "Do you think she'll change?" Her father took a breath, let the silence settle first, and answered, "Maybe not overnight, but sometimes a single crack is enough for the light to get in." And Zara nodded, not needing more. That moment in the sky hadn't been about power or revenge, it was about clarity. The story would travel far beyond the plane, passed on in quiet conversations. In the way people watch each other differently. In the gentle reminder that strength doesn't always have to shout. For Bethany Caldwell, it might become a ghost of shame. Or maybe, if she lets it, a doorway. But for Zara, it was never about her. It was about all the girls told to shrink, to smile through it, to sit quietly. And now, with the clouds parting above her and her father's hand resting beside hers, she knew with every part of her, she'd never be silent again.